Welcome all. We're delighted to welcome the group that's joined us here in the Rady Room on the UTA campus. We're also delighted to welcome the group that's joining us via either live streaming or recording today to our final presentation in the Link series this semester. So on behalf of the Link Lab, I'm delighted to welcome you to Designing and Running a UTA MOOC. I should note when we wrote this particular title, there was only one UTA MOOC. Today we are actually going to talk about several. One that's currently in operation and one that is in preparation for running this coming spring. And we're joined by the two individuals who are leading those initiatives here at UTA. To my direct left is Dr. George Siemens, who is the Executive Director of the Learning, Innovation, and Network Knowledge Lab, the Link Lab. We're delighted to have him here, in particular today, as a pioneer in the field of MOOCs, in which we hope to out him a little bit relative to his history in this area. Pranesh Aswath is Associate Dean for Graduate Studies in the College of Engineering, who is spearheading the initiative within College of Engineering to bring edX and MOOC forward in their thinking relative to online learning as well. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to start to both of them to tell us a little bit about their background in online learning, and then we'll ask them to segue into a brief introduction of their MOOC initiatives and MOOC planning and projects. I'll ask George to start us off today.
Sure. So my background, I guess, was in the late 90s. I was at a college in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and we were the first system in Canada that went exclusively laptop in our program. So 200 students received a laptop. And the interesting experience that I found was that the front half of the classroom, where the teachers were not much changed. Instead of using slides or transparencies, they were using PowerPoint. And yet in the back half of the classroom, everything changed in terms of the attention span of learners, the types of activities they were engaged in, ICQ for messaging, downloading music at that time, early stages of downloading movies as well, and so on. So that was really, for me, a fascinating outcome, is how the same technology on one hand reinforced existing practices on the front of the classroom, but completely changed new practices of education in the back half of the classroom. So I've spent most of my time trying to understand why. What does that mean? Why did it happen that way? What is it about the technology or about the roles that we play within a technology setting that causes us to engage in some of these different activities? So as a result of that, I've been involved in teaching either with technology in a traditional classroom setting, or teaching exclusively online at a master's and a doctoral level, or running open online courses.
Yeah, my background in online learning actually goes back a long time. The very first course that I taught online was 1992. Of course, this was before the internet was born, really. So that was primarily using a television network, reaching out to industry folks in a two-way microwave connection. And the nice part about that was the fact that you could have real-time interaction between the people at a distance as well as the people in class. However, that was not a tenable solution in the long term, simply because of the cost of running such a system. And so for many years, we ran that system, and then subsequently that died a natural death. And in the last year or so, I've been re-engaged in the distance learning initiative, largely from the MOOC approach. One of my passions has always been in the area of preparing high school kids for a career in engineering. So at that point, we initiated a proposal to edX, proposing an idea of having a introduction to engineering and engineering mathematics. Again, when we talk about engineering mathematics, the intent was, of course, to better prepare high school kids for a career in engineering. So my interest now is more from a MOOC approach in trying to reach a broad audience so that you're able to impact a very large number of people, and at the same time, a diverse audience as well.
Before I ask George to talk a little bit and demo his current MOOC, I do want to out him just a little bit, as I promised. He mentioned he was part of some of the early MOOC development. He's actually considered the coiner of the phrase MOOC, and that initial team, I think, has really shaped our thinking about learning at scale and large-scale courses to this day. So Having said that, we're going to ask him to walk us through his current edX project and show us some of the features and thinking behind it.
Sure. So one of the things that we've tried to do with the current form of MOOC, so there's different ways of articulating what is a MOOC and what is the structure of a MOOC. One way that's commonly articulated is around the C and the X MOOC example. The X MOOC being something that's typically more structured and sequential, more emulating what happens in a classroom environment, and the C MOOC being something that is more networked and distributed. Now, in some of the dialogue around it, think of these not as absolutes, but more just 2 points on a continuum. There's different shades of both prevalence. So one of the things we tried to do with the current MOOC is to try and run something that was dual layer, is the term that we've used to describe it, meaning there was the open, unstructured type of an approach, and then there was the linear sequential approach. And generally the response has been, it sucks, and so there's a few things at play with that, which I'll talk about. I don't want to go into great detail on it, but we can certainly talk about it a little bit later on, because the learner response, as one person put it, says, I've taken 12 MOOCs and this is the worst one I've ever taken. And so we have those comments, but we also have other students who say, this is terrific, this has been such an enlightening, such a valuable learning experience, and so on. But let me just articulate how the course is structured. So on the one hand, you have edX, and so this is much like a regular MOOC. So this week, for example, we're doing prediction modeling, regressors and classifiers, and so as this comes up, you'll have your token video that will address the topic. You'll have follow-up videos that go into a little bit more detail. Then you're going to have some activity that you're involved in. In this case, you're going to install a piece of software and start working with it. And then there's some competencies that you're expected to achieve as part of this work. And then we have added in the course as well as sort of some bonus views, just people from the field, interviews that we did during the Summer Institute while we were at our Summer Institute at Harvard in Learning Analytics. That's the topic. That's the course structure, very sequential. You click through to get what's happening. We did a few things with it that are different. So one thing we did is, so we've got a visual syllabus that Matt Crossan put together. He's the designer on the course. And so you'll see basic things like social learning. These are opportunities for students that want to move outside of regular spaces. And so you'll have the details of Twitter. We have a range of course tools that are articulated, some tools that you're using for learning, some tools that you're using to learn the course content. So Twitter, for example, is one tool set that is used quite a bit. So if you follow, for example, just go to Twitter and do a quick hashtag search on DAL-MOOC. So you have, for example, one individual that shared with us, just unenrolled from DAL-MOOC on edX, may continue to follow on Twitter. So these are the kinds of things where it's, oh, that's nice. But you have some conversations that relate to the course, but they're distributed and learner-owned. Another aspect of it is in a tool set that we've been working with a fair bit, which is called ProSolo. This came out of some work that a colleague of mine did out of European Union initially, and more recently I've been involved with him for the last several years, as well as a couple other colleagues. And this is basically a social competency platform. I don't want to go into great detail, but learners define the kinds of work or learning that they want to do, and you basically connect and share the work you're doing, and others can collaborate on that. There's also a credentialing pipeline, we call it, where if you are finished, you can share an assignment that you've achieved, that you think you've achieved in terms of outcomes. Other people, learners in the course, or faculty can come by and mark you or grade whether or not that was completed. So there's really three spaces. There's edX, which is structured. There's the online space, which is really everything, all over the map. Twitter, Facebook, could be done in the different blog sites. It could be wherever somebody wants to involve, Google Plus and so on. So that's the second one. And the third one is the semi-structured space of ProSolo, where you can integrate activities that you're involved in with your mainstream. And so one of the things we generate on a daily basis within ProSolo is a feed. And the feed includes everybody that's blogged, everybody that has tweeted about the course or the course content. So you have feeds and you have course tweets that are all aggregated on a daily basis. And anytime you see a feed where somebody has blogged about something in a particular overview, then they can add it to a competency, or they can say, oh, I'm interested in this, I'll add it to my learning, and then they can tag it and start following. So that's roughly the course structure.
Pranesh, we'll pass it to you.
Yeah, the course that I'm putting together is called Introduction to Engineering and Engineering Mathematics. It's 2 parts. The first part of the course is primarily dealing with introducing a high schooler to what engineering is all about. By and large, in high school, you typically take the traditional courses in science, like physics, chemistry, mathematics, but you don't put a context to an engineering career. So the goal of this course is really to expose students in the context of what our faculty are doing in terms of their research and tying it back to their high school experience. So the goal really is not necessarily to teach them the high-level material, but rather contextualize what they're learning today in the context of what they will potentially learn if they get into an engineering career. So as part of this first part of the course, there are 2 things we're going to do. We are also going to introduce students to the issues of engineering ethics, the context of engineering as a career, as well as entrepreneurship, because a good number of engineers end up building their own companies, but very few of them have the tool set to transition from being a technical specialist to being a business person. What does it take to take an idea, protect the idea, and then get it to the marketplace? We recognize that this is still a high school kid, so it's not going to be done at a level where it requires significant knowledge of economics and so forth, but rather at a level at which they can conceptualize what it takes to take an idea from concept to reality. The other part of it is really to look at different disciplines in engineering, everything from biomaterials or bioengineering, aerospace, mechanical, civil, and so forth. And instead of giving the textbook knowledge of what each of these fields are, we're going to bring faculty in to share their experiences from the point of view of their research experience and tie it back to their discipline. So that forms the basis of overall 50% of the course. The second part of the course is really to deal with engineering mathematics. One of the main problems we face, at least in large urban universities, public universities in the United States, that we lose a number of our students after their freshman and sophomore year because they're unable to cope with mathematics. Part of it is because of the fact that they learn mathematics as a discipline, not necessarily in its context to engineering. And so by the time they get the context to engineering, it's almost too late. They have lost interest in the field. So in order to keep their interest alive and to relate mathematics to engineering, we're looking to introduce this at the earliest stage, potentially at high school or at the freshman level in college, where they can take real world problems and relate them to mathematical concepts to solve them. This includes everything from linear equations, quadratic equations, derivatives, integrals, as applied to fields such as statics, dynamics, circuits, and so forth. So that's a broad outline of what we're trying to do in this course. And this course is not going to go live till May of next year, so we're in the early stages of putting together the content and people who are going to be teaching the course.
And actually, Pranesh, if I could keep you on the spot, could you talk a little bit about how this course will reach unique audiences, students of diversity, international audiences?
Okay. Actually, the course is advertised on edX already, so we have about 4,000 students sign up for it. And the interesting aspect about this is we were thinking we were going to drive this primarily for high school kids. Turns out 40% of the people who have enrolled for this course have a bachelor's degree. 40% of the people who have enrolled for the course have a high school or lower. 20% of them have PhDs. So go figure. There are obviously people who want to come back and retool themselves. But what I do not know is whether they have a PhD in engineering or a PhD in, in theater arts. But nonetheless, our context for teaching the course still remains. Our primary target is really to reach high schoolers and freshmen. So we're going to approach the course from that perspective. The fact that we do have a lot of college degree holders and PhD holders is actually a bonus. I think it will enrich the overall conversation. And in terms of the reach, right now, at least as we speak, about 25% of the enrollees are from the United States, and about 17% are from India, and the rest are from all other parts of the world. So we do have a fairly diverse audience from over 140 countries. So we, at this stage, we're able to reach a very broad portfolio of people. I do not have the detailed demographics of ethnicity and so forth, but this is just a global audience.
George, could you talk a little bit about the diverse audiences in your course, and then also the potential of MOOCs for, say, underserved students here in the U.S.?
Yeah. Well, so in terms of numbers, numbers are always a funny thing in MOOCs because on the one hand they sound impressive, but on the flip side they're really rather meaningless. So, for example, with the current course that we have 20,000 students that signed up, which sounds like, oh, that's nice. But we had, of those 20,000, we had probably around 50% that actually logged in. I don't know what the other 20,000 did. They probably just wanted me to spam them on a weekly basis with my emails because they get those regardless. So that's interesting, is why the sign-ups and the actual activity is a very different thing. We had a similar profile to what Pranesh was mentioning. We have about a quarter of the participants, a little more, are from the U.S. A smaller percentage are from India, but still double digits. And then U.S., India, right after that, the next largest is UK at 4%. And so it's 25, 30, you get to India, 15, 20, and then you get to low single digits for next level. The student population is all over the map, and that's the difficulty with the MOOC. It's basically like hosting a public barbecue where anybody can come and eat, but there's that homogeneous profile that we expect in higher education, where it's a student that likely is a sequential from high school to university, or might be returning to the workforce or to the university after being in the workforce. But generally, we're thinking under 30 would be sort of a typical profile of age for someone entering university. Whereas in a MOOC, it's completely different. These are individuals who are there for a range of reasons, personal, just curiosity seekers. We're starting to see a profile of perpetual MOOC takers. These are people who, they just like taking MOOCs. The number of folks in this course now that have said, I've taken a dozen or I've taken 15 different MOOCs or more is actually quite surprising. We also have a range of language profiles, meaning that sometimes the way that, which throws on its head a lot of what we understand about discourse in a course, for example. If it's an online course, there's certain general views of discourse. So how to ask a question, how to ask for help. There's general standards. And so if someone just says, help me, then we would say, okay, but maybe more information would be nice. Because I don't know if you're in your computer and your house is being robbed, but or if you just don't understand a concept. But so in our case, some learners, this is language and other barriers, that this is what you get, and you don't know what it means. Whereas other students will clearly articulate, this is the problem I'm having, this is the browser I'm using, this is the platform I have, this doesn't load. So those are the challenges. There's language issues where somebody will come across, like one student, for example, had a few opinions about the course, and I had replied to them, and then she came by later and apologized and said, oh, I was far too rude or too direct. But that's because English is a second language for her, and so some of the ways in which this is interpreted is different. So we have differentiation by geographical region, by academic attainment, by motivations for being there, by language, by whatever. So it's almost impossible to say this is a MOOC student because they're so all over the map. It's very difficult to articulate. One of the challenges, though, is that people are trying to use MOOCs and online learning in general to solve a very complex problem, which is underrepresented students and their success educationally. Difficulty is that it's being touted as, well, look at this. These students will have access to terrific learning materials, and that's true on one level. But the research is reasonably clear that adding technology to someone who fits an underrepresented student profile will make their learning experiences worse. Access isn't the problem. It's a range of social and institutional support structures that these students don't have. And so that's a big issue with some current grant work that we're involved in, is how do you better meet the needs of underrepresented students when they start learning with technology.
I think, as you can hear from some of these discussions, and something that I think surprised us as an institution was how data-rich a process running a MOOC is. I'll throw it back to George to talk a little bit about how data flows behind the scenes as the MOOC is going on, because that's an element of this space many people are familiar with.
Yeah, I mean, certainly that's one of the big opportunities. And this is one of the reasons it's been fascinating that MOOCs have actually drawn the attention of a range of different people that regularly don't really pay much. So suddenly teaching and learning is cool. And all those people that have run learning centers or teaching and learning centers on campus for 30 years are I guess, a bit irritated because the revolution that they waited for is suddenly sort of bypassing them in some regard, because now all of a sudden you have papers in computer science journals that are articulating, look at the wonders of paying attention to learning, and or some very antiquated research methodologies or very limited variables that actually get at what's happening with the student in a course. So it's a bit frustrating for people that have had a long interest in the scholarship of teaching and learning, because it is almost like an entire field, engineering, math, sciences, computer sciences, woke up to this idea of teaching and learning practices, and certainly teaching and learning with technology. So that's been an interesting outcome. But the data is on, there's a lot of it on one level, but unfortunately a good portion of that data is fairly limited in what it can tell us about learning. So for example, we can gain insight around social networks, who talk to whom in a course. We can gain some insight into discourse data, where we look at how are people interacting with one another, what are their rhetorical moves, if you will. There's some work that Carolyn Rosé, who's involved with this course as well, she's doing with a group helper tool called Bazaar, which provides some social or peer learning data as well. So you get a range of clickstream data as well as limited profile data, because edX does and Coursera as well, they do a terrible job of building profiles of students, which means you don't know who took what. You don't have a learner profile that allows you to click and identify who is that student, what kind of courses have they taken, so it's quite limited. What we've done is right now, so Martin Hoxie developed this tool called Tags, which allows you to archive tweets and other activity related to a course or to a particular event. So we've been archiving tweets to start articulating the social networks. We've been evaluating social networks in the edX forums. We've been using data, or collecting data around what's happening in Pro Solo. So we're trying to get a sense of what's going on in these spaces. Some of it's interesting, but at a low level interesting. So for example, in edX, the first few weeks were very, very heavily instructor focused. So not unusual when you consider that's what happens in an XMOOC, where it's more sequential and instructor based. But that experience where you pull out, if you look at the network analysis of the graphs, I can send a link to a hangout if anyone's interested, where we talked about this, a couple of PhD students that did the analysis on this. If you pulled the instructors out of those interactions, like the whole network would basically crumble, because they're the key bridging nodes between these individual community clusters. Twitter, similar kind of a challenge. There's some very central activity going on with instructors, but there's a little bit more connectedness between learners that isn't quite as instructor reliant. Facebook was almost non-existent for interaction.
Pranesh, I know in conceptualizing your MOOC and planning it, you've been thinking about the employment sphere. And this is a space that the MOOC discussion frequently bumps into. Could you talk a little bit about how you see this space as a bridge to employers, involving employers, better preparing for employment, where those connections are?
Well, that's actually a much broader question than what we are trying to address in this particular MOOC. I guess from an employer perspective, there is a great need for training, in a sense. So currently, that is filled by a number of third-party suppliers of training modules and so forth, for-profit organizations. The opportunity that exists is really packaging materials in a fashion through a MOOC approach, which can be then tailored for each specific industry. And I think the opportunity there is quite large. I am personally not involved in something like that. From this particular MOOC that we're trying to develop is largely to prepare students for an engineering career, not necessarily for the workforce. That comes 4 years later after they finish their bachelor's degree. And the area that we would like to really focus on is student success. If there is a way to tie in participation in this MOOC to their success in an engineering program or a STEM program for that matter, then I think we have solved a major problem there. So I would focus in our case largely on trying to get the data of the students who take our MOOC and then follow them over a period of time to see how many of them actually end up in a STEM field and how successful they are. And we should be able to get sufficient data in our MOOC that we can maybe differentiate downstream on those that have done well in a MOOC to ones that haven't done well in a MOOC to see if we can correlate that with their overall success. That's the goal. I don't know if we'll succeed in that or not, but that would be something we would like to pursue.
George, you've also bumped into MOOCs in the corporate world. Well, how, I know it, as our interest in higher education has sort of grown and waned in MOOCs, you called this year the year of the corporate MOOC. So do you want to explain yourself?
Sure. Well, the year of the corporate MOOC was sort of, because that's the area where there's income for organizations like Coursera and edX at some level. Udacity, which was one of the early MOOC players, they went from wanting to change the world to wanting to teach people how to program. And so they've really shifted to the corporate space. They're now just targeting employment, so they've got initiatives like a master's program with AT&T and Georgia Tech and other things like that that address that. We ran an online event on corporate MOOCs, and right after the event I said, oh, I was wrong, it's not the year of corporate MOOCs after all. Because we had, now maybe it's just the difference between higher education, which is quite willing to share and engage and talk about what they're doing, versus the corporate landscape, which isn't. So we had companies like SAP and Google, and we had World Bank, and we had CorpU, and we had a range of Google and other companies that presented during this particular event on what are they doing with MOOCs. And this is one of those things that the biggest trends often aren't the ones that are being hyped to death. The biggest trends are the ones that no one's really paying attention to. And so that's one of the opportunities, I think, with corporate MOOCs, is that when the person at Google who spoke, and they didn't allow us to record this particular session, they were quite clear. I mean, MOOCs are central to what they're doing with organizational learning and development. The same holds true with SAP. I mean, they're knee-deep into MOOCs and how they're using those to connect with others. World Bank, UNESCO, and other organizations as well. You have companies like Google that are running MOOCs on how to use Google, or you have organizations now recently, was it last week, I think it was announced that Coursera had reached an option for people, I think it was with Veteran Affairs, where somebody who had military service could get a free certificate or a formal signature track courses with Coursera. And so I think it's an interesting time in that the corporate landscape, there's an awful lot of stuff going on, but they're mainly talking about what's going on through press releases rather than giving us sort of a detailed sense of what's happening. But there's some significant monetary activity in the corporate landscape.
We've danced around this issue of higher education and how higher education relates to some of these more open spaces, some of these experimental spaces like MOOCs. And I think we've, in many cases, approached it with suspicion, it's fair to say, from a higher education perspective. And so I wanted to ask both of you to comment on that, and here's where I'll pull out Elvis, I guess, and say, can we go on together with suspicious minds? Can higher education and these more open experimental spaces coexist well?
I think so. I think if you look forward 20, 25 years, the university of tomorrow is not going to be recognizable because knowledge will be accessible in multiple different modes, multiple different spaces, and on demand. And so the universities have to find a way to differentiate themselves in some way that is different from how students get information. One of the areas where it will be particularly critical is the for-profit institutions, which charge a lot of money for education, whether it's a private institution or just a small for-profit institution. So they have to differentiate themselves in the value proposition of what are they bringing different to the table for a student by the time they graduate. Is it personal relationships? Is it a personalized education? Is it a way in which you interact with others? Are you building social skills at the same time as learning knowledge? If it's just a question of delivering knowledge, we should be able to do that relatively easily in multiple different ways. You don't have to go to a university to do that. So I think in many ways we can be suspicious, but we cannot ignore it. That's a key. I think if we decide to do things the way we are doing today, we'll probably run ourselves out of business in 20 years. So we have to find ways and take the ones that work well and run with them. And then things that don't work well, we throw them by the wayside and try something different.
George, are we caught in a trap and we can't get out?
Maybe only in terms of puns. I think the MOOCs are a symptom. They're not a trend. And they reflect a range of things that have gone on societally, socio-economic and related trends that are fundamental. They've changed many segments of society, whether it's publishing, music, how business is conducted, and so on. So from that perspective, MOOCs are a reflection of these very dramatic undercurrents that have or are placing pressure on society as a whole. By themselves, they're nothing. I mean, there's even though we had initially, Udacity came out, and there was a famous quote where the CEO said that within, I think it was 50 years or something, there would only be 10 universities in the world, and Udacity would be one. And I think I really have to start finding out the right biblical verse for this. But I think there was somewhere, there should have been, if there isn't, in the Old Testament, a discussion where if you predict but you don't get it, you get stoned. And and there's a lot of, and we're not talking Colorado stone, but there's a lot of folks who've made bold predictions about what's happening. Like Clayton Christensen, for example, has doubled down on, in the next 15 years, half the universities in the U.S. will be obsolete. And at that point, 10 universities left in 50 years. There's some really silly things being said by individuals. But that's typically if they're not understanding, I think, what's really happening. And what's happening is just that undercurrent of social, technical, and economic trends. And Carlotta Perez has written about this quite extensively. But these are the things that change big institutions. Like a MOOC does not change big institutions. A MOOC is too small to make a big change. But it's the undercurrent of what's happening technologically, economically, and socially. Those are the kinds of things that change big institutions. And so I think in that regard, the university itself, it's really part of a bigger digitization of what happens in higher education. So let's say in 5 years' time, we hope that the word MOOC won't be used anymore in public settings. And we'll have something else. But whatever that new trend is, it'll likely be something to do with adaptive or personalized learning, because that's where things are trending. But wherever that new trend is, it still has to reflect that we're seeing society becoming digital, and that's causing us to think differently, reflect differently on the education process as well. We really don't have a clue exactly what that will cash out as, but it's very unrealistic to expect regions to say, yes, we will give up our local economic hub. And I find this so fascinating. You enter a knowledge era, full force, where we are now, something that's been predicted for 30 years, and the first thing that pundits want to do is kill off the university, the one knowledge-generating organism in society. I always find that baffling, how that would happen. And so I was at a panel recently, and Clayton Christensen was there, and Jose Ferrer from Newton, and a few others were talking about how so many universities will be dead in the future, and then we all sort of have a short talk to do it. I said, we're going to see globally in the next 20 years a net increase in the number of universities around the world. We're not going to see a net decrease, because in a knowledge era, you need knowledge institutions.
Did Clayton take you up on the bet?
There wasn't a bet, but there probably should have been.
Yeah. You might benefit monetarily from this. We've had the year of the MOOC. We've had the year of the anti-MOOC. We've had the year of the corporate MOOC. If you had to put a label on next year.
Lederhosen. The year of the Lederhosen.
The year of the Lederhosen. We'll take that as cultural diversity in online learning. We have some questions online from our participants. We also wanted to open it up to questions from folks in the room. If you are online on Twitter, hashtag UTA link to submit questions. So we'll try and mix questions from the room with those from afar. So please, thoughts, concerns, questions, folks who don't want to wear lederhosen next year.
What motivated edX to consider, excuse me, K-12 MOOCs? Like if this is like George was saying, reflecting on other undercurrents, what is the motivation to do K-12, and where do you all see that heading as far as K-12? And when I say K-12, it's really like 8 through 12, right? It's not, certainly, I'm a former elementary teacher, and I'm just trying to envision
actually it's interesting. I have looking at the data set on the age group of the people registered in the MOOC. There are some in the 11 to 13-year-old range. I'm guessing the parents logged them on, I guess, but nonetheless, there is a small group of people. To answer your bigger question on what prompted edX to do this, it was a philanthropic donation that came their way. It was a foundation that gave them over $1 million to go out and try and initiate high schoolers in STEM fields, and in particular their focus was on advanced AP classes. So they sent out a call for proposals for this, so AP Physics, AP Chemistry, Mathematics, Calculus, and so forth. So the broader focus of their effort has largely been in the area of AP. And so AP is, again, from the point of view, there are a large number of people in the United States, and for that matter worldwide, that are self-learners. They don't necessarily go to school. They're homeschooled. So this opens up opportunity for them to actually get all this content delivered to them. So that's one way, one of the aspects. The other aspect is, of course, for self-driven students who want to learn more, and instead of, in fact, for example, if they're already taking an AP Calculus class and they want to supplement their knowledge with additional online resources, then they could sign up for a MOOC and learn things online and then supplement that with their in-class needs. So that's where that came from. There are about 25 of these that are being funded so far by edX from across the country. And I'm proud to say this is the only one in engineering. Everything else is in mathematics, calculus, physics, chemistry, and so forth. So.
We have a viewer online who asked about the disappeared MOOCers and metrics that we might use to think about success in MOOCs other than did they log in or did they finish? How might we approach some of these things? And the second part of that question, by definition, do openness and flexibility make metrics such as finishing a measure of any value?
In my eyes, finishing has very limited value unless you know the motivations. Someone who drops out, who starts a MOOC that says, I want to finish this MOOC, but doesn't finish it, that's a very different type of a student than someone who starts a MOOC but has no interest in finishing it. So it's kind of this idea of you don't finish a library. It's a resource that you can go into, get what you want out of it, and that's fine. But that's the role of it. So with MOOCs, success is a very different thing. It's very personal. As I mentioned earlier, you have such a huge range, such a diversity of student populations in terms of age, in terms of income, in terms of geography, academic success or completion to date. So you can't, in the general, assess success in MOOCs. I think you can only assess success in MOOCs in the specific, like at an individual level. When you join that MOOC, was your intention to finish the MOOC? If it was, and you didn't finish it, that's a success problem. On the other hand, if you joined a MOOC like about half of the students in our MOOC did, but had no intention of ever logging in, then that counts. But those are the stats. That's why there was such glee when early success rates came out for MOOCs, because faculty initially ignored MOOCs for the first year and a half when they were gaining popularity on edX and Coursera. And then all of a sudden they paid attention to it, and then you started hearing 5% or 10% completion rate. And this caused significant joy to a lot of anti-MOOCers, even though some cases, if you look at a 4-year university program, I wonder what your success rate would be like on that as well.
I think from my perspective, I would really like to understand where the roadblocks are in the learning process. When I talked to edX, they said they can provide us data, very granular data on each and every segment of the course. For example, when do you lose a student in a MOOC? Is it in the first week, second week, third week, or when they're going through a specific concept? Maybe I'm being, naive in looking at this, but I'm hopeful that as we put this MOOC together, we may be able to isolate areas where they may have difficulty. For example, when they're looking through a video, if they wind back a section multiple times to relearn a concept, it tells us that that particular concept is rather difficult for someone to understand. That kind of data will be available. So we'll be able to look through these with a great level of granularity in trying to understand areas of particular interest and how they respond to questions or quizzes and so forth. So from my perspective, I think if we're able to get this data, large amounts of the data, then we may be able to understand the learning process of where students fall through the cracks, and that would help us better define this course the next time we offer it.
Please.
Any words of wisdom or new developments in the matter of assessment for as it relates to MOOCs?
Yeah, I mean, that's not just MOOCs, I mean, higher education. The idea of changing assessment is probably one of the more boring but simultaneously exciting aspects of innovation, if that makes sense. So on the one hand, assessment is one of those things that, you know, we have scholarship of teaching and learning, and we emphasize the teaching and the learning aspect and process, but assessment is still there hasn't been a lot of variety in that space. Now, more recently, with the growing interest in university systems across the U.S. towards competency-based learning, that's certainly generating some interest in what does that look like. Using portfolio approaches to assessment generates some interest. Automated assessment or automated scoring, controversial to say the least, because the thought of writing a 20-page paper and having it, as one person put it, is that it's immoral to have people write something that will not be read by them. And so that kind of articulation, it seems to be, if I spend this time, 20 pages of writing, then I want a human being to assess it rather than a machine learning algorithm. Other aspects, Coursera has used peer-graded learning extensively, where you have your peers do an assessment quite extensively. With this case, we did primarily self-assessment with our current MOOC, where we could say students are, you know, here's a competency, if you've achieved it, provide your evidence that you've achieved it, and then yay you, you've done it. But and then within Pro Solo, there's a more rigorous process where you have to provide individual elements of evidence that supports the particular objective that you say you've achieved, or the competency you've achieved, and then that is submitted to a review pipeline or a credential pipeline, we call it, where other peers or teachers or TAs or whoever would assess that and then basically indicate completion or not, or if it's not, provide feedback.
That's still honor-based?
Pardon me?
Still honor-based?
If it's the students doing it, or peer assessment, which is one part of it, yes, but you could certainly set it up so it's only TAs or others that do it. I mean, one area that might be of interest, that you'll likely see coming more and more with MOOCs, is that this idea of honor-based or peer-based assessment, it just seems like it's not the same as having someone mean do the assessment, namely a faculty member. And so I think what happens in that kind of an approach, we'll start to see Coursera saying, you know, here, and this is really what to do with their certified tracks, is that you're going to get better, more focused feedback and assessment. So it might be you take a UTA MOOC, if you want someone to grade you on that specifically, pay an extra $75 for proper grading, whatever that looks like, and then a human being will assess and evaluate rather than just your peers doing that assessment work. But somewhere between peer, automated, and more human-based traditional model, that's, I think, where the assessment side of it will fall.
I think part of that, the success of those peer assessments is largely based on how well you define the rubric for grading. If you define a good rubric and you're able to do the assessment in a fairly streamlined fashion, I think you get a better outcome, as opposed to just throwing it out and say, grade this in a score of 0 to 5 or whatever. So.
Well, another aspect there that this is a big part of the issue is what is that you're wanting students to do. I mean, so when I see, like, rubrics are I guess fun for the whole family. And but if you're a student and you see the rubric for assessment, all you do is you tick boxes, and that causes me a bit of a mild rash because it's a tick box approach to learning rather than a creative, dynamic kind of an approach to learning. And I think students should be creative knowledge generators at really all stages of the learning process. It's not something that has to wait until you're in industry and working. And so an argument I've been making for years is that the future of the university will track the architecture of knowledge, meaning how knowledge is created and generated within society, how it's shared, how it's validated. If that pipeline, that process, that's what universities will be like in the future. And so today we're generating a lot of checkbox students. These are people who can jump through the right hoops, answer the right questions, and yet it's basically anything that can be automatically assessed, in my opinion, shouldn't be assessed. There needs to be more richer, more authentic approaches to it, knowledge generation and knowledge building approaches. Difficulty with that is it's vague and nebulous, and people that want accountability and concise outcomes don't like that approach. But at the end of the day, companies today that want employees in any type of a knowledge-oriented field, they don't want checkbox employees. They want the creative, dynamic thinkers. They want the people that are willing to think divergently and work together in a team-based environment and so on. So it's almost like we're using technology today to make the perfect employee for 1920s.
Well, actually, in one area I disagree with you because, for example, if you take computer programming, you could set up an automated system to assess your computer program. It doesn't necessarily have to be how efficient the program is in solving a problem, but if you're trying to teach somebody programming and you want them to walk through the process, you can initially tell them, look, develop a program that gets you the solution. It may take 500 steps to get there. But by the time you finish the course, you need to be able to write a program to get the same solution probably in 25 steps. So you have significantly improved your logic. So you can use your computer program to do the grading for that and not have any individual actually look at the program, but in the process you have helped the student actually go through the steps of improving their way of putting their logic, their algorithm together, and so forth. So in some areas, you could do that. You know, for example, I was talking to Joe Warren from Rice University, who teaches Python, and he has, I think, over the last 4 times he's offered that course, has 500,000 students registered for the course. So clearly, it's not possible for a human being to grade the programs. So he has developed this rubric with a machine assessment, which is actually quite efficient in doing that. But I agree with you that it can't be applicable to every field. But probably computer programming could be one that perhaps it works.
Other prompts, questions, comments? Tom, please.
As an instructional designer, my core interest is how students learn. What do they do with it? How do they use it? Okay, that's one part of what I want to talk about. The other part is storytelling. If you look at Jerome Bruner and some of his work on storytelling and its ability to improve student learning, because a compelling story can be remembered. If you looked at your courses, your MOOCs, could you explain the course in terms of a story, the beginning of it, with an arc? What would it be if you could tell a story about your MOOC?
Well, I mean, every MOOC would have a slightly different focus. So I could tell the logic of a MOOC, the ones that we're teaching right now, which is what is it we're expecting learners to do. A large part of what I look at from a storytelling perspective, at least, is that that's where students inject themselves into the process, which means that the students tell the story, not necessarily me. That the student's ability to, so for example, visualization. Now, a lot of these approaches that we use for taking and communicating complex ideas, the reason stories are so effective is that they're suitably ambiguous, that we can see ourselves in them. Meaning that when someone tells a story, I don't know, an Aesop's fable type of thing, even though it's not terribly precise, but we can see ourselves in that impatient person or this and that. And that's what's instructive about it, is because it's not a sanitized, contained logic stream. There's ambiguity. And so that process of narrative has been a sense-making strategy historically. It's how we, don't pet the dinosaur or whatever else that we learn and then we communicate down through narrative over time. With data, with analytics, we're doing something quite similar. And so when we do work in the current MOOC, which is on learning analytics, what we're trying to communicate is that the way you visualize something is essentially in the spirit of a story. There's a narrative behind the data. You might have a nice image that says, this is what happened to students here, or this is how many students, or this is the social network that was formed. That's really just that entry point into a narrative or into a story of some kind. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, yes, there is a narrative arc in the story, but within each individual learning activity that learners do, there's the opportunity for them also to write themselves into this rough architecture that we've created.
Well, I guess the story that I look at when I look at this particular course is, again, as I said, there are two parts to the course. The first part, the story, is really tying together what we see and do in real life with engineering context. So everything we do, we get into a car, we drive to work, take an elevator to go up the stairs, or you use a computer, all of which were designed and built by engineers. So putting that in context of a high school kid is very important. In what are the knowledge skills that they need to learn so that they could succeed and be part of that broader enterprise where you're able to design and build and deliver some products. So that's what engineers do. The second part is on the mathematics side, which is trying to contextualize everything that happens, everything from when you slam on the brakes, what are the rate equations that you can use to determine deceleration? When you throw a ball up in the air, how do you determine the rate equations, the nonlinear equations, or differential equation that you have to determine, or when you throw, somebody gave me this example, you throw a frisbee to a dog, and the dog actually intuitively has done the calculations as to where the frisbee is going to land. It looks at the arc going up. There is an equation that describes that arc and where that frisbee is going to land, and the dog is able to go grab the frisbee. Can you come up with an equation that defines that? So that's the context of taking real-world experiences, putting that in the context of mathematics. So that's sort of the story we would like to weave, that a lot of things you see that happen naturally have in their underlying basis a strong mathematical foundation.
I get real frustrated with products of public school who think that learning is still in the right bubble on the answer sheet, and asking them to move beyond that. So I get thrilled when you talk about MOOCs and seeing themselves in the story. Will MOOCs influence this one right answer on the bubble sheet kind of education system that we have?
Yes.
Good. Yeah. Glad to hear that. How long do I have to wait?
No, I mean, that's what they do. Like I said, MOOCs, in the lack of vision, all people end up reverting back to established behaviorist pedagogies. And that's exactly what we saw in the first generation of MOOCs that came out of both Coursera and edX. It was an engineered computing solution to a complex social problem. And so variables were dismissed. And even now we're seeing that. Some of the conversations that we're having we're taking an approach of construction that would work well for buildings but bad for human beings. And so that's part of the challenge I think that we face, is having a broader vision around that. I read an article last week which was horrible. It was called MOOC 2.0, which is, there should be a rule, you can't amplify buzzwords with buzzwords, but apparently in this case we didn't. But so they're saying, well, it's going to be more social, more interactive. But right now MOOCs are doing the exact opposite. They're helping to instantiate a pedagogy of very much behaviorist origin. And that has, at some levels, that can be all right, early beginning stages of a knowledge process, but it needs to move to generation and construction, which many of them don't.
Tom raised the question of instructional designers and the team that builds a MOOC. As we finish up here, we've got just a few more minutes. Can you both say a little bit about the team? It takes a village to raise a MOOC, maybe?
Well, my team is still a work in progress, so it's a major challenge because I'm trying to have as broad a representation as possible in this. So I'm looking at about between 15 and 20 faculty members are going to participate in this MOOC. So the nice part is every single one I have talked to so far has said yes, but I've not finished my talking yet. So I have still got to meet a good number of people. But I have Tom and Brett, who are going to be my instructional designers, who are going to help on the content development and integration. But the faculty are the ones who are actually going to develop the content. So we're going to have between 15 and 20 faculty who are going to participate in this.
And so in our case, first of all, I guess it's really important that you listen to the learning literature, because things like length of video, for example, is a huge factor. You give me a 10 or 11 minute video and I'm not going to watch. It's just, anything over 5 minutes, that's a no-brainer. You just don't even watch. And that's borne out by what you see from what students, once you have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of students that have done it, those are the numbers that you get. And you have to somewhat pay respect to that. Either you're going to be very engaging and do very media-rich type of learning activities, or you treat the 5-minute cutoff as a pretty serious thing. So I think you have to really turn to the literature, both in online and digital learning, but also the emerging MOOC-based literature that exists. So in our case, we had Matt, who I mentioned earlier. He was the designer on the course. We had a group of 4 faculty that were involved. We started off with a design jam sometime in, I think it was April of last year, where we brought a group of folks together to think about what kinds of attributes would we like to see have in a MOOC and so on. So really it is a team-based approach. We've had people involved that have done video work in the course. Brett was mentioned earlier. We've had people that have done design work. We've had, and that even then, this is still early stages for, in our case. If you go to systems that have run a dozen or 2 dozen MOOCs, especially that are well-resourced, you go to Harvard and it's like walking into a television or a movie studio, because it's been set up to produce very high-quality MOOCs in terms of content. When I was in Switzerland at Lausanne, EPFL, which is one of the top, almost MIT of Europe, I think is their tagline, but one of the top systems out there, they had a really nicely set up recording studio. You walk in, everything was set up. You load your PowerPoint. You've got your on the screen writing tool with the shot overhead of the hand doing the writing for equations. You had the green screen behind you, which would capture video of you. You would have a range of touchscreen interfaces as well, top quality audio that was produced. So if you're going to do MOOCs seriously rather than sort of as a side project, and right now it's been, with UTA at least, it's been a bit of a side project, because we don't have the recording booths and recording studios. We don't have the graphic designers that help to produce these elaborate videos. So in Princeton, for example, course that was to spend thousands of hours on graphic design work. So I think these are the kinds of questions you have to ask in the kinds of teams you put together. But there's bigger questions about organizational support resources. Do you have your video booth? Do you have your set recording times? So at EPFL, for example, their recording booth is booked from 9 to 5 every single day because of the number of MOOCs they're running. And they're now building, I think, 3 extra recording booths within the next several months just because they're so busy. They've got an entire video team dedicated to it. So their MOOC team alone is around, I don't know the exact numbers now, but from what I saw, probably around 10 people to run the kinds of MOOCs that they run. So it's quite significant.
We've got about a minute left, so I'm going to toss one last question to George. He is cast aside Elvis and set himself up as an Old Testament prophet. So if there's one lesson from you as our active MOOC leader that you would pass on to the rest of us that we might not expect, what else might you warn us about?
Well, if this wasn't recorded, I could give all kinds of inappropriate advice. But I think probably the biggest thing is fail. Like, just experiment and fail. I've been whining about this for a while, but the first couple of rounds of MOOCs, sometimes you hear MOOC leaders of the big MOOC companies. They'll stand up at a conference and they'll say, universities haven't changed in 200 years, which of course we know is nonsense. We've changed enormously, but my response would be, well, MOOCs haven't changed since 2011. I mean, it's you've settled on this one formula: video, a little bit of interactivity, forums, boom, there's your MOOC. There's been no innovation in MOOCs since we started. It's been the same stuff, just duplicated now. And I think we optimized too quickly on that model. So my view would be, try things, experiment. If nobody comes by and says this is the worst MOOC they've ever taken, you probably failed. And so push different approaches, experiment with content, experiment with accreditation models, experiment with how you deliver and how you get students to interact. But just play. I mean, that's the big thing with these kinds of opportunities, is we're at a key experimentation point. So don't settle on the first thing that works. Keep kicking the tires until you actually get a vision or an innovative idea.
And both of our presenters will be here for questions afterwards. I know we're on time schedule with our stream, so if you would please join me in thanking our presenters, and then we'll ask them to stay and address questions afterwards. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Elvis Presley and the Old Testament prophets.
You had a question?
Before you get away with this heavily produced video, you don't